Good morning. We're going to be starting the webinar in a couple of minutes, but just a couple of housekeeping notes. For me, I'm Matthew Kilcoyne. We'll be joined by my colleague, Gavin Freegard. This session is being recorded. The recording will be available online later this week, I think, maybe later in the month. Please feel free to ask questions throughout the chat. Drop them in the chat. We'll be looking at them throughout the session. There'll be a Q&A at the end for about 20 minutes. Please note, though, that you're not going to be on screen asking questions. So if you want to ask questions anonymously, feel free to do so. We'll make sure that we keep a note of whether it's a public comment or an anonymized comment, just to make sure that we've got free-flowing debate. As I say, we'll be starting the webinar in a couple of minutes just to allow people to come in to the chat. Brill. Just again, please share any thoughts, put questions in, ideas, areas for discussions, issues that you're seeing, horizon scanning into the chat, and we'll note those and make sure that we have those in the discussion for about 20 minutes of a Q&A at the end of this webinar. We will be recording this session once again, and we'll be sharing it online. Although if you do ask questions, you won't be on screen, so you can feel free to put at the end of a question in brackets that you want it to be anonymous, that you want to be kept anonymous, and we'll make sure that we answer it, but that we keep your anonymity. That allows that kind of free-flowing debate that I think is quite important for here. Brilliant. I think we'll get started, and if anybody else joins us, they are more than welcome to do so. Do feel free to send the link out to anybody you want in your organizations as well. Just a bit about us, in case you are brand new here to the Open Data Institute, welcome. And a special welcome if you have been with us before. It's always welcome to have people who come back. It means that you managed to put up with us. The ODI is a non-profit company that aims to build a world where data works for everyone. We believe in building public trust, accountability, and innovation. We are a non-partisan institute, which is why I'm studiously for this policy webinar wearing red, white, and blue, so that none of the colors of the party, all the colors of the parties are involved. You are joined today by Gavin Freegard, the special advisor at the Open Data Institute, and myself, Matthew Kilcoyne, who is a senior policy advisor here. Part of that world in which data works for everyone involves an open, trustworthy, and data ecosystem, all of which is a nice feedback loop. And we'll come back to some of the principles that guide the ODI later on when we discuss the policy roadmap and the ideas that we're putting forward, thanks to many of your contributions and the network's contributions later in the webinar, because there are lots of ideas that are going into this incredibly busy legislative session in Parliament. But first, we'll give you a quick debrief of what happened at conference, sometimes seen as either Labour or Tory Christmas. These are gatherings held outside of London where the entire circus gets transported to a city. So in this case, in this year, Liverpool and Birmingham. And also Brighton for the Liberal Democrats. They are a bit of a jamboree. But also they're an incredibly good place to network with people. You meet people who are all fighting on the same issues or having the same ideas, and you haven't realized that you've actually had the same ideas. And politicians hardly get to let their hair down a little bit. They get to meet their actual members. They get to have a good time. They actually get to maybe enjoy the fact that they've just won an election. Or maybe enjoy the fact that they've left government and are finally free from some of the responsibilities of being in government. I'll hand over to Gavin now, who has a bit more insight as to what happened just up in Liverpool with the Labour conference.
Thank you very much, Matt, and good morning, everyone. Great to have so many of you with us. As Matt said, yes, we're now through party conference season, which is a really important part of the political calendar, and I think can very much set the tone for that busy legislative session that we've got coming up. So we're just going to take you through some of the key points from some of those conferences. So starting with Labour in Liverpool. Yeah, sort of overall mood of a party coming back into government for the first time in 14 years. You may have seen quite a lot of sort of negative media coverage that it perhaps didn't feel that uplifting. And I think it would be fair to say it didn't feel like a sort of jubilant victory lap. I think partly because some of the political challenges the government's faced over its first 100 days, as it now is. And I think the sort of general economic climate, and obviously Labour has been saying a lot about the inheritance that it's had and what to do about it. I have to say, though, I actually had quite a good time at conference. I thought when it came to discussions about data, AI, and digital, I actually thought it was much more grounded. There was a lot more practical discussion than perhaps we've been used to in the past. I'll say a bit more about that in a second. But there is no denying that part of the change in mood was also because with Labour in government, there were a lot more sort of corporate lobbyists, lots of think tanks, lots of people wanting to put on events there, and perhaps fewer members at some of those fringe events, because at Labour Party conference, you've got things happening on the conference floor, which is where lots of the politicians are giving big set piece speeches, but you've also got votes on motions. Then around the rest of Liverpool and the sort of conference centre, you had lots of fringe discussions being put on by various people. What were the sort of themes that came through? Well, when it comes to data, AI, digital tech, um, I think in general, there's been quite a big emphasis from Labour on two things. The first is the importance of AI and tech more generally in being part of that sort of growth mission, but also a focus on public services and how AI can transform those. Peter Kyle, Secretary of State for Science, Innovation and Technology, talking about both of those things quite a lot in his various appearances. So some of the things that were coming through were around AI and public services and what that actually looks like in practice. So digital transformation in general of private sector organisations for productivity as well as for public services. There was some discussion about where AI might fit into the industrial strategy. And we'll be saying a bit more about that shortly. Digital inclusion came up quite a lot. There was a lot of discussion that the UK has not had a new digital inclusion strategy for about a decade, and that might be something that a Labour government would be particularly interested in. Some real nuance in the discussions that I heard about that as well, that we shouldn't just think about it as being a problem for older people. It's various people at different age groups and in different demographic groups. A lot about skills as well, and what we need to do about that. And quite an interesting discussion about whether the UK should focus on adopting new tech and trying to push the frontier, or whether it's more about diffusing the tech that we've already got and how we sort of balance those different things. Diffusion such that small, medium-sized enterprises and other sectors, not just the private sector, can make the most of data and AI as well. There's a fair bit of discussion specifically on regulating AI. The Minister for AI, Ferial Clark, was talking about where AI is posing a danger to life and limb. There'll be legislation coming on that, and we'll talk a bit more about that in a second as well. But also slightly more surprising was the suggestion that we might be seeing some legislation at some point fairly soon around AI, the creative industries, and copyright, which is not necessarily something we'd expected going into conference season, but it sounds like the government, DCMS as well as DCIT, might be doing something on that. Moving away from Labour, just very quickly to note, as well as the parties, the TUC, the Trades Union Congress, had their conference at the beginning of September, and there were some motions there on AI, one specifically on young workers, AI and automation, but also another composite motion which brought together various things on AI regulation, skills training, and again, that sort of copyright and the arts issues. So you can see the interest there very much growing and not confined just to Labour conference. I'm going to do my best, Chris Whitty now. And next slide, please, Matt. And I think you're going to tell us a bit about Conservative conference.
Yeah, I will. Just before we do though, I think one of the really interesting things that I saw at Labour conference, Gavin, as well, was that we had some rising stars from the new MPs that were there. That really, I think some of our network, some of our contributors should also take note of. I think, you know, Samantha Niblett has been involved in Labour Digital for years. Dan Aldridge as well. Everywhere at conference, I think. But we also saw a panel with you know, Lucy Rigby and Kanishka Narayan, the Vale of Glamorgan MP. and Steve Race as well. Like, I think they were genuinely quite engaged. They were genuinely on topic and switched on, which makes such a difference for this topic, right?
Totally. And I think bringing different perspectives as well. So, for instance, Andrew Pakes, who's sort of long-time trade unionist, talking particularly about with a focus on workers and what data and AI means for them. Kanishka, you mentioned, I think very much from a sort of almost venture capitalist and funding perspective and how we make the most of that. Lucy Rigby bringing a much more sort of legalistic perspective, I think having been a lawyer focusing on tech. And then Josh Simons, formerly the director of Labour Together, who has sort of got academic background in AI as well. So it's as you say, Matt, I think probably the most data and AI literate intake that we've had, and bringing quite different perspectives on that. And I think we'll return to some of those names a little bit later when we get into the new select committee landscape.
I think we will. I think we will. So I also headed up to Birmingham for my sins, to a conference that I think Kamala Harris would describe as unburdened by what has been. The Conservative Party conference may well have come at the end of a 14-year-long stint in government, and you might have expected, after a historic loss, for it to be a really downbeat mood, and frankly, a little bit, even frankly, maybe a bit miserable. But it really wasn't the case. It was, there weren't as many lobbyists. There may be a fewer journalists, but the actual numbers of members was about the same as it has been in the last decade. There were actually more MPs there than there usually are, even when they had 2.5 times the numbers, and especially the more ambitious young ones who are looking at shadow positions in cabinet. But it was dominated not really by discussions around even data and AI, but really about the leadership of the Conservative Party, which is ongoing. It was in that period where they were down from 6, but had 4. There were 4 at the conference, all vying to get the final 2, which are now in the running to go to members, and are then announced after the budget. The final 2 obviously being Robert Jenrick and Kemi Badenoch. After some quite severe maneuvering, I think, in the final stage that managed to mean that James Cleverly, having gone into the final day ahead, got knocked out. Quite what happened there remains a tight-lipped secret, I think. Having said that, though, there was sort of a sense of a theme in terms of the discussions that we did have around data, AI, use in the public sector, and more generally about some of the issues that we're seeing in tech. So the MPs and ministers who had been involved in the Online Safety Act passage, defending its passage, defending the powers that are given to Ofcom, and also more generally defending the role of regulators, including the ICO, which is a very interesting scenario. We saw Katie Lamb, who's a new MP for the Weald of Kent, who was also aspired in the Home Office, quite pro the idea of facial recognition technology being rolled out across the police sector. So there's not necessarily a sense that the party is going back to where it was in the noughties, with a strong civil liberties bent, and maybe opposition to some Labour strong states positions, but continuation really of policy. Now, that is all up for grabs depending on the new leader, because the new leader in the Conservative Party sets a lot more of the policy in the agenda than is traditionally in other more democratically organized parties, for good or for ill, depending on your viewpoint. At least shadow ministers are well aware of the incoming reshuffle. A number of the shadow ministers were involved in the leadership teams of them, so they are kind of expecting a big shift in responsibilities, which we're going to see. And what was really interesting for me was there was a session run by Lord Kempsall, launching an organization called Conservatives Together, which, if you know the Labour Together movement, which has been so successful in putting people right across the Labour Party and into winnable seats and then into government, is a really interesting idea. Is this just a funny copycat designed to get headlines and attention, and more importantly, views from Labour? Or is it really parking tanks on the lawn, especially of other Tory factions? I also thought the really interesting thing was that the talk prior to the election of sort of 5 families, that kind of mafioso breakdown in the party kind of went away, and a lot of the leadership debate, a lot of the leadership teams are made up of people that you would not necessarily expect to be working with each other, which I find, which is really, really fascinating, and will mean a lot for when the new leader's installed, that there is a little bit more unity in the smaller party than you might expect. The Liberal Democrats headed down into to Brighton for their conference prior to Labour and to the Conservatives. They're the kind of scene setter. If you ask any journalist which one they prefer, it's mostly the Liberal Democrats, because it's sort of the end of rosé season. There's still a little bit of sun and there's the seaside, and they haven't got flu yet. But the really important thing for me, I think, was that having gone into that with the changes, like the select committee chairs, their two select committee chairs, HSC and EFRA committee, having been announced, they had to do a bit of a reshuffle of their top team. And one of those really interesting names is Victoria Collins has been named as the Liberal Democrat Science, Innovation and Technology spokesperson. They did pass a motion, and in fact, Liberal Democrats passed motions on the floor of their conference, set policy for the year, calling for an industrial strategy that includes AI. They've got one to some degree with the Labour Party's industrial strategy. We'll come back to that in a minute. But also we saw a retention of focus on issues that they went into the election with, especially around water quality, but also now air quality as well coming in. And then more generally about reporting around climate change, net zero. This was very similarly seen in the Green Party conference. Gavin, I think you saw that there was an AI regulatory framework motion passed at the Greens.
Yes, that's right. I think the last couple of Green Party conferences have talked about motions around AI regulation, and I think trying to work out what their policy might be on that, and sort of broadening it beyond some of the frontier AI discussion. Again, we'll come back to that in a second. To think about those sort of wider societal and particularly environmental harms as well. So yes, there was a motion passed. As you've noted on the slide, the 4 Green MPs, the biggest representation they've ever had in Westminster, don't actually have a party whip, which is the person telling them how they should vote and what to do. So we'll see how that plays out. But it does feel like there's a sort of growing sense within the Green Party that these are issues that they need to take seriously. And in fact, their manifesto probably had more on tech, data and AI than any of the others. It's a really interesting read if you have a spare few minutes and nothing better to do.
That's definitely true. And then we also saw them launch their Greens Organise at conference as well, which is a kind of a group within a group within the Green Party, which is designed to keep the Green Party separate and different, and offering a very different policy platform from the Labour and the Liberal Democrat parties. It's an anti-capitalist group, but also more generally is mostly about making sure that they've got resource and they've got focus, having, as Gavin said, won more MPs at the last election than they ever have before. We'll quickly flip now over to the legislative agenda, because it is absolutely packed. We've got over 40 bills from the King's Speech. We've probably got another 1, maybe 2 to talk about, but the fraud bill and the AI bill, but we'll come back to those. Gavin, I'll hand to you first, because the big one is about to drop, isn't it?
Yes, that's right. So a data bill, the more things change, the more they stay the same. You may remember, those of you who've been following the ODI's work over the last couple of years, that there was a Data Protection and Digital Information Bill, DIPDIB, as we nicknamed it, under the previous government, which did not pass before the election. There was a lot of controversy around some of the measures in that and what it might do to people's data rights, also what it might do to the Information Commissioner's Office, and there were particular controversies around data on people's bank accounts being more widely accessible to the Department for Work and Pensions, and also some political party use of data. That fell before the election. It was not passed. Labour said that it would also pass a bill that's going to be called the Digital Information and Smart Data Bill, or DIST, as we will refer to it as. We're expecting that could come into the Commons next week, 24th of October, next Thursday is the date that many of us have heard. So we're still waiting to see exactly what will be in there. We know from the King's Speech briefing a few months back that there are certain things that we would expect to see. Those include continuing some of the less controversial parts of the previous data bill, so establishing digital verification services to sort of help people understand which digital identity products and services are secure and
I
trustworthy.
do have to apologize, Gavin, because I wrote digital identity at the top of the slide.
Well,
I got it so in my head that it's like, but you are right, it's digital information and smart data, Bill.
But it does have digital identity in there in terms of the digital verification services, but that is not to be confused with a sort of digital ID or digital ID card, which there's also been some policy discussion outside of government around in recent months. This is slightly different. This is about enabling a trust framework for private sector solutions on that. We also understand that it will develop the National Underground Asset Register. That's something that's existed for a few years and government's already been working on, particularly through the Geospatial Commission, which should improve planning and safety for excavation work, because obviously it's a map of the underground in the UK. Smart data is something that we care about at the ODI. And again, there's a sense that this bill will help launch the next wave. We've obviously had open banking. There have also been consultations recently around open communications. So waiting to see exactly what's in the bill that will enable future smart data schemes, which should make things easier for consumers. It says that there may be something about improving data sharing in government and specifically through amending the Digital Economy Act to help with that. Not seen a huge amount of detail on that yet. And it's interesting that there's been a lot of discussion, a lot of rhetoric from the last few governments about improving data sharing within government. But actually, when it comes down to the legislation, there wasn't much on that in the previous data bill, so we'll see what's in this one. There's something in there about supporting scientific research and allowing broader consent for research to make use of people's personal data. That could prove controversial. I think we've got some sense of where there might be battles over that, which will be around how people's personal data is defined, what those sort of new consent mechanisms look like, and how research is defined. I think some people have suggested that it might be such a loose definition that a lot of commercial research would come into that, and that may not be to everyone's liking. And there's also a bit in there which talks about ensuring data is well protected. So that will modernise the Information Commissioner's Office, the main data regulator. Some of that is really quite uncontroversial. It's about changing it from what's known as a body sole, where all of the powers are in the commissioner, to a body corporate, which would distribute that power across a board and a much newer, more modern governance mechanism. I think a lot of people feel that, given how much the ICO has to deal with and how quickly things are changing, that's sort of quite necessary. We've also got, well, again, I think we're still waiting to see exactly what the detail is on that, because the sense that data will be well protected and that there will be new and different powers implies that there could be some changes to the data protection regime. And again, we were not happy with some of those in the previous bill, so we will see exactly what happens when it comes back to Parliament next week. Obviously, it'll take much longer for it to actually move through the Commons and the Lords and the various different stages, so it's going to be a while yet before it's passed, but we should get a sense of the shape of it next week. And Matt, I think I might be handing over to you to talk a bit more about smart data within that context as well.
Coming through the smart data schemes, one of the issues that I think we're going to see is, although the UK's legislative period and legislative time is actually relatively quick, if you want to pass a bill in a day, you can pass a bill in a day. Now, obviously, I wouldn't recommend it. That's how you end up with mistakes, issues, and complications and unforeseen circumstances, but you can. But the longer that a piece of legislation takes to go through, the longer that we've been waiting for this, and we obviously did with the DPDI and to some extent, and now again with the introduction here, the longer that you have between primary legislation that goes through and then secondary legislation that goes through, identifying schemes, mandating innovation, or mandating areas for cooperation. And that necessarily then has a feed through in terms of cost to businesses setting up or wanting to work with those sectors. Now, we at the ODI I'll help with the Smart Data Council, and we signed with our non-governmental members a response to the last government's Smart Data Roadmap back in May, agreeing with and saying that we should promote the original work streams in finance, transport, energy and road and fuels, telecoms, home buying, and food retail. Areas that the UK actually has pretty developed, well-advanced markets, but where actually the data schemes can bring real value. But there's a real movement to this. I think like if you start doing these now, if we get more security on these areas, they're definitely going to be followed through with. That they're definitely going to be the focus for the smart data schemes. That the ministers are definitely involved in these and behind them, then that means that the whole of the industry can move into them and that people can start businesses, create those innovations, that we end up with spillover effects, not just in our economy, but also others, because other countries are copying smart data schemes. And actually, there's some evidence that we get a first mover advantage by bringing these forward. And we saw with open banking, open finance, some incredible schemes. We actually saw open banking and open energy at the Conservative Party conference speaking about their experience over the last decade, especially open banking, but now that whole fintech sector is providing exports and expertise to the rest of the world. And there are some really great advantages to be had if we also do that across these schemes. So part of our urge is to the government does treat this as a priority, and that they see the benefits of doing this sooner rather than later, because every day the delay ends up with cost to us all. The next bill that I'm going to quickly go through, and I'll jump through as we lost a bit of time there with me dropping out. Sorry about that, guys. Again, the Product Safety Metrology Bill is one of those bills that has sort of it's a boring name. I don't know if you've seen In the Loop or The Thick of It, the film version of The Thick of It, and they're looking for the War Committee, and it's a really dull committee name. The Product Safety Metrology Bill sounds really boring. It's like it could not sound more boring, in fact, I think, to be quite frank. But it has a huge amount of potential for being a flashpoint in this parliament, because it about setting safety standards. It could end up with divergent from the European safety standards, or it could end up with convergent with the European, or mirroring European safety standards. But one of the really interesting things in the King's Speech bill, in the King's Speech briefing notes, was that it mentioned AI. And it mentioned AI safeguards. There is some discussion about whether, and therefore it was a question of whether whether all of the safety chat about frontier AI was going to end up in the metrology bill. I don't think that's the case anymore, Gavin. I think you may have some views on this. We are going to see an AI bill separate, standalone. So it may be that some of this has been superseded by that. However, the fight on equivalence of products and services with the EU is likely to end up with a bigger question between the opposition and the government, and Reform as well. We can't forget that Reform are currently sat in third in the polls, over 20% on a regular basis now. So the idea that they're going to not make any noise on this if they see a betrayal, or in their words, of Brexit, is likely to end up with a flashpoint, at least in media, if not in the House, with the large majority Labour has. The Cybersecurity and Resilience Bill. A lot of this is about expanding essential digital services. We actually saw, although this is not related to the bill, but we saw something really fascinating this week, which was data centers are getting classified as critical national infrastructure. Which means that in a power shortage or power scarcity situation, that they get priority access, similar to hospitals, fire stations, police stations, the rail network, and so on. That's a really fascinating piece, right, Kevin? That this is being classified, that these centers are being classified as like totally central to the UK's ability to operate, never mind like build. And I think we're going to see in this security and resilience bill a whole area of attached to sort of looking, and actually probably quite a good focus on what's behind the scenes in the UK's. Have we spent enough in the UK on making the public sector resilient? Have we made enough on the private sector resilient to cyber attacks, foreign attacks, those who mean us harm? And it really does have like a really fascinating increase in regulated powers, including cost recovery mechanisms. And requiring proactive investigation of potential vulnerabilities. You will not just now be able to say, "Oh, well, we didn't know this. We are going to require firms and also public sector managers to make sure that they know their vulnerabilities and that they're trying to fix them ahead of time. The AI bill. Gavin, do you want to come in here?
Yeah, let me say about the AI bill. So there is an AI bill coming, and coming fairly soon, but it will be very tightly focused. It will focus on the frontier. So that's that very small number of companies who are building the most advanced models. You may be aware there's been a lot of discussion around existential risk versus the kind of everyday risk in terms of deployments that we're already seeing. This is going to focus on the frontier. It means that it's expected to focus on only two things, which is putting the UK's AI Safety Institute on a statutory footing, so turning it into some sort of arm's-length body of government rather than just a unit of the Department for Science, Innovation and Technology. And it's likely to make existing voluntary agreements between the UK government and those big companies legally binding. So we're expecting a consultation to come on that shortly, and then the bill to appear in pretty short order and remain very tightly focused along those lines. That said, it sounds like there will be further discussion about the wider AI regulatory landscape. We know there was a white paper from the previous government which looked at that broader piece, and is taking a very different approach to the EU. The EU is focusing on the risks associated with different types of AI model and what they do. The UK approach has been to focus on how regulators, existing regulators, will regulate the use of AI in their particular sectors. So we're likely to see some more discussion of that to come. We've also heard discussions around child protection, online safety, misinformation, disinformation. We mentioned copyright earlier. Obviously, data centers also bring some sort of environmental costs. There's a net zero discussion in there as well. So the bill that's coming will be very focused on the frontier, but we expect there to be a bit more detail coming on other things. There are also other things going on with AI in the public sector. The Algorithmic Transparency Recording Standard, we're expecting government departments shortly to publish details of the algorithms that they're using internally. And as we've got on the slide, before I hand back to Matt, just to say, we sort of saw in California recently just that the power of sort of lobbying efforts from big tech and from others around a bill to an attempt to legislate there. So expect the AI bill could be quite interesting, even if it is very short.
Yeah, diplomatic language I put in there around an interest in its progression. The other bill that I think is quite important, but mostly because of what we saw and discussed at conference, the Skills England bill. This is a bill sort of taking over. I mean, it merges in some respects transfer functions from the Institute of Apprenticeships and Technical Education to Skills England. It's a new body that was founded this summer. We saw a lot about digital inclusion, about making sure lifelong learning, making sure that people aren't forgotten, but also one of the themes that I think actually Samantha Niblett was talking about on the panel that you saw with Chris Packer was that young people quite regularly are sort of seen as digital natives, that they are assumed to have incredible ability to use all these tools and skills and software packages, but that's not necessarily the case. In fact, those already people who have already lost out in education are the most likely to then not even have digital native skills as well. So they're then doubly locked out of an economy and then doubly locked out of jobs and progression and the ability to accrue wealth. So some of this, and also more generally, getting ready, I think, for some of that disruption that we may see in the labor market from emergent tech and from changing global trade patterns, to try and allow and encourage lifelong learning, and replacing the apprenticeship levy, which was obviously just designed for younger people around apprenticeships, with a growth and skills levy for value, which will have some data behind it, behind funds targeted and value for money training. And there's an element here where we're starting to see maybe some joined up thinking. I'm hopeful. I'm crossing my fingers around the devolution agenda. It's not just devolve and forget, but actually there is some regional collaboration. They want to hear from local government. They want to hear from you guys. They want to hear from local mayors and even the nations and regions for their local skills improvement plans and how they can fit in with Skills England. What skills you need, what jobs you've got, what companies you've got, therefore, and what gaps you've got, and therefore who they can help and how, which I think is really, really interesting. Antonia Bance introduced the Westminster Hall debate on this on the 9th of October. The bills itself, I don't think, has ever been laid. It was a really, really interesting discussion. I would encourage you to go and look it up. She's previously of the Trade Union Congress, to give you a bit of flavour as to where she comes from. And obviously, they've given a huge amount of focus to lifelong learning over the years. So well worth a read. But there's some other relevant bills. As I said, there's a jam-packed session. Whether they manage to get through all 42 now is another one, is a different one. The Great British Energy Bill will have huge implications for energy, for data in the energy sector, including open energy. We are moving from the bill, although the bill is mostly about setting up Great British Energy up in Aberdeen, it will have implications in terms of the investment that goes across the whole sector. So, fraud bill, Gavin, I think causing consternation in the civil society sector, right?
Yes, that's right. It seemed to be the continuation of those controversial measures from the previous government's data protection bill, which would give powers to access data about people's bank accounts. So, yeah, I think keep an eye on that one for some political heat.
Yeah, I think also we expect some level of kickback on the children's wellbeing bill, just because of the data and who's involved and how. It will be a really complex discussion. I imagine this will be one that the Lords gets really, really into the weeds on, because the databases of who's at school, whether they're not in school, the data that has to be shared between agencies and new child protection duties, all has massive ramifications right across England. I kept the Skills England in there. Ignore that. Crime and Policing Bill. Again, this will have facial recognition rollouts. So expect some debates about the use or misuse of that technology, as well as crime data collection powers and analysis being introduced by forces. The Audit Reform and Corporate Governance Bill is changing the way in which we do corporate governance in this country to include not just financial measures, but also non-financial data reporting with new impetuses and issues given to directors that they have to take account of. It sounds like a really boring bill, really, really important. Will be behind every company, every institution. So it's one for the nerds, perhaps, amongst us. Very enjoyable though, if you enjoyed that. And then planning and infrastructure bill. This is where I think the interesting debate around net zero and data centers is likely to end up playing out. Whether that ends up being a Christmas tree piece of legislation rather than the AI bill itself may well be interesting. But we'll also see, as we saw at Labour conference, one of the things that we also saw was this big YIMBY contingent, I think, Gavin. I think it'd be fair to say, I think there were sort of 15 YIMBY events at Labour conference over the 4 days. They're very much in charge in terms of the zeitgeist, whether they're actually in charge in terms of policy decisions or making. But the planning and infrastructure bill will be a real fight between YIMBY policy set from the top and new MPs suddenly getting letters about projects and building work in their constituencies. And that will be really fascinating to watch, because it was obviously one of the sticking points for the last government, with Robert Jenrick and various other ministers deposed as they came up against local councillors. But beyond legislation, there is also the National Data Library. Gavin, this one I think really is for you.
Thank you very much. Yes, as if that wasn't enough to be getting on with, there's plenty of other things going on as well. The National Data Library was a major manifesto pledge in our sort of policy area. And the pledge was to create a national data library to bring together existing research programs and help deliver data-driven public services whilst maintaining strong safeguards and ensuring all of the public benefit. What does that actually mean in practice? That's an excellent question. And it's one that DCIT is currently trying to answer. So I think we're still at early stages, and there is a team within the department currently focused on thinking about the National Data Library. I think some of the emerging thinking is that there might be very different things that this thing could be serving very different user needs. So actually sorting out the sort of data sharing problems within government, providing a sort of research, a data spine for researchers and academics, and then also thinking much more about data for innovation, maybe training AI models and supporting businesses. So quite different things within that. I have to say, I've spoken to the team thinking about this at the moment, and they seem very willing to engage. They've been trying to get out and about, and I suspect we'll see a lot more of that coming over the next few months. Next slide, please, Matt. In the interest of time, I'm going to put a link in the chat to this. But as you would imagine, the ODI has views on what we would quite like to see from a national data library. You can see the vision and goals and some of the key design considerations there. But I will hand back to Matt and just put a link in the chat so you can follow up what we think about the National Data Library. It'd be great to get your thoughts on that as well, because I think it's very much an emerging thing and something that can be shaped.
And please do put your comments and questions in the chat. I will come to them in a minute. I will quickly squeeze through. We also saw yesterday the publication of the industrial strategy by DBT. There is a consultation open on this. There are lots of areas where data is going to be massively important, especially around the growth driving sectors. We saw clean energy, creative industries, likely to end up with a fight around copyright there. Cloud computing, big data, energies there as well, clinical trial data in the life sciences. All of these deserve input, but also the Department for Business and Trade is asking for your input. There's a consultation, I think, open until the 24th of November. So please do get your comments into them. Also tell us, I'm more than happy to hear your comments because I'm also going to be submitting to the consultation. So if I can take you out on board, I will. Well, for the interest of time, I'll skip this, but the Industrial Strategy Council is really, really interesting. I think that there is a big fight around copyright coming under that because creative is one of those areas and the big tech firms are on it. So they are on the council. So there is some element to which who knows how that ends up playing out. The policy roadmap for the government, we launched this in September. This is really about our response to the legislative program that came out, but also updating our manifesto from earlier in the year. A lot of you will be familiar with that. I will put a link to that, or I'll send out a link to that as well. But this broadly, and a lot of this we've talked about around what we want to see around Skills England, the National Data Library and data schemes, all of which we talked about today. But please, again, do let me know your thoughts on that if you managed to give it a read. Would love to hear from you. And Parliament of the People, this is a quick one for Gavin, I think, where sort of key people are going to come through in these debates, and then we'll get to your questions.
Brilliant. Thanks, Matt. Yeah, new Parliament, which means new select committees. Those are the things that scrutinise the work of government. They're becoming increasingly powerful. We now know who's chairing some of the most sort of data and digital facing committees. The key one there is Chion Moura, Labour MP for Newcastle, who will become an influential, is already sort of well known in Parliament for her engineering, data and sort of science expertise. You can see some of the other key figures there in terms of how data is used in government around the Public Accounts Committee, the Public Administration and Constitutional Affairs. The committee chairs are carved up between the parties according to the election result, and the same goes for the membership on each committee. So you will find more Labour members on each select committee than any other party. We now know the Labour members of the Science, Innovation and Tech Committee. So they include Alison Gardner, who's worked on AI ethics in an academic sense, and I think in the NHS as well for a while. Josh Simons, we mentioned earlier, former head of Labour Together. We also unexpectedly have a couple of Conservative members, George Freeman, the former Science Minister, and Kit Malthouse, former Secretary of State. We were expecting to wait until after the leadership election to see how that fell, but apparently they've already been appointed. So that's interesting. And just to say very quickly as well, some other things to watch out for. We've already had a Commons debate on technology and public services. Really useful to see where Peter Kyle is setting out his stall. And again, there's a great emphasis on being able to shape some of this technology and how it's used, particularly within public services, but also to see where Andrew Griffith, the Shadow Secretary of State, was coming from as well. The Lords are particularly interested at the moment in lots of things around online safety, data, digital AI, so plenty of questions they're raising in the House as well. And just that final bullet point, there are some reports that Labour MPs have been told to iron out any disagreements privately with ministers rather than amending bills in public. So we will see how that one plays out. I'm sure the Lords will continue to have fun amending regardless.
That's true. I found that the most fascinating publication because the Whips put that out knowing that they would be seen to be putting that out. And they knew that, and I wondered whether it was a way of flushing out potential opposition or potential rabble rousers or troublemakers by saying something totally objectionable up front and seeing who would come out of the woodwork. Because you have to remember, there's so many new MPs. Lots of the Whips don't know these MPs, so there's like, they've got to get to know them. Also, very quickly, you can read this, but we've got a lot of things going on. It's not just about what's going on in Parliament, although the budget is coming up and that will dominate discussion for the next couple of weeks. So it already is to some degree. There is a reorganization happening with the Digital Service and going to DCIT, and more generally the GDSO taking over, coming from the Cabinet Office. And that's a really, really fascinating move because it means DCIT's actually quite a powerful organising force across government. There is also maybe some EU-UK negotiations that will involve next year, but we've also got noises off. The US election is coming. on the morning of the 6th of November, it could be quite disruptive to the UK political system, depending on various groups. But we've also got the confirmation of EU commissioners. Environmental campaigns unlikely to carry on. There is geopolitical instability, obviously overseas, and all of that will impact the ability and the bandwidth of Parliament. So thank you very much, guys. I will quickly go through questions, and I will. Ooh, let me just have a quick look at what's come in. Gavin, is there anything that's
Well, I mean, lots of great questions, some of which we've hopefully answered, but I'm going to type some responses to some of them as well. We've got Muzan Shikari asks, says they'd love to hear what the general understanding and goal of digital transformation was among members of the cabinet. Was it making processes efficient, better financial outcomes, or more public good causes? I think we're still seeing exactly what is emerging there, but I think broadly there is that very strong sort of data and AI for economic growth and improved productivity angle. So I suppose efficiency is sort of inherent within that, but there does also seem to be a better public services focus, and the way that Peter Kyle and DCIT have been talking about that a little bit is sort of saving citizens time and reducing the administrative burden on their lives to have to interact with public services. So that's been a sort of key line that we've seen coming out of them so far. I think within the sort of digital government community, I think there's an increasing sense that there's a lot of focus on efficiency rather than sort of delivering better services, and that you actually might need to invest in doing in delivering better services, and it can't just be about the efficiency. So I think that would be quite an interesting discussion to watch play out.
It did also drop their productivity targets, right, that the last government had set for the public sector. One of those, I don't know, and there was some degree to which that was a pie in the sky figures delivered by Jeremy Hunt, maybe designed to sort of give some headroom, I think fiscal headroom, to allow him to spend or borrow. The dropping of those maybe feeds through into Rachel Reeves' own fiscal plans, but yeah, there's if you lose some of those targets, though, do they not necessarily sometimes lose some of the focus on trying to deliver though? Who knows? David Noble asks, the US significantly outpaces Europe in new funding for AI startups and data center infrastructure. One reason for this disparity is the impact of EU regulations. Can the UK avoid similar regulatory constraints? Based on current developments, is the UK likely to take a different path? I think it's a really interesting question. I think one of the UK obviously attracts a huge amount of inward investment, both actually for small firms and medium firms, even from Americans buying out firms in the UK of all size and scale. Actually, data centers, I think the UK has more data centers than any other European country. But one of the constraints that we're always going to have is our industrial cost of energy is so much higher. And unless you manage to suddenly change or halve the UK's energy costs, it's going to be a lot more expensive to have them in the UK. But that does not necessarily mean that the questions around data sovereignty are going to go away, or that data localization are going to go away. In fact, they're probably going to become more and more prominent. The UK and the EU, whether the EU and US and UK have more burdensome regulations, well, there is some fairly sort of stark facts around size of firms, of tech firms, and the types of various sectors in the US, the UK. I think the Draghi report from Europe suggests that the EU has fallen behind the US quite significantly, and productivity per hour worked in the UK and EU is far behind that of the US. They are a much richer country now. Whether we necessarily want to have some of the more lax approach to regulation is a genuine moot point. The Labour Party has tacked a bit more pro-business and a bit more big tech than I think many of its maybe its ecosystem thought it was going to go in. I don't know if you.
Yes, I think there remains a sense within the civil society that perhaps we're not being brought into some of these conversations as much as we might be, and you know, it's actually some of those civil society organisations that can see both the opportunities and the harms that might be caused by some of this deployment, and very much on the front line. again, there are exceptions to that. I mentioned the National Data Library team, who I think are making a real effort to listen widely. Just looking at a couple of the other questions as well, and sort of going back to what you've already said, Matt, around AI particularly. I think somebody's asked, does the UK still have an agenda in terms of global leadership in relation to AI? And it feels like I think the UK would like to be, and I think it's, under the previous government, that focus on the frontier, on the existential risk, having that AI safety summit this time last year was a sign of that. There is an upcoming, as the questioner notes, there's an upcoming meeting of different AI safety institutes. I think the UK is keen to play quite a big role in that. I think a lot of the discussions that I've been hearing over the last few weeks do actually come back to that question of what is and what should the UK's role be in that global AI and also sort of data leadership, because there is a sense that obviously the US is a huge player, China is a huge player, the EU is a huge player. The UK, may be seen as a bridge between some of those different blocks. It also goes back to that point we touched on earlier around adoption and diffusion. Where is the UK's strength? We don't have the sort of OpenAI, Google's, or sort of Nvidia's of this world. So where is the UK's sort of competitive advantage? And that's not just an economic question. I think that's a sort of geopolitical one as well. So I wonder if we will see a bit more on that. And just to underline again something else you said, Matt, and I've seen this come up in the chat as well. I think we are going to be hearing a lot about data centers over the coming weeks and months. And I think Tom has suggested in the chat, I think there will be more focus on the environmental considerations around those, because obviously they, especially the bigger AI systems, take a huge amount of energy, but also a lot of water in terms of cooling those systems. And we're seeing sort of interesting experiments about heating swimming pools and using the swimming pool to cool the servers and things like that. So there's that's potentially quite an interesting area to explore.
I love the idea of a local school swimming pool powered by your data center. Frankly, it's bask in the warm glow of AI, or bathe in it maybe. I've been told off for using the term digital native, so I won't use that anymore. I also thought the NDL, Ed Parsons says the NDL seems to create a great opportunity to create national data registers and improve efficiency, maybe an open property register, including address data. You love address data, Gavin. I'm going to hand that one straight to you.
Free the path, free the postcode address file. Some of you will be aware that there's sort of been a growing campaign that the postcode address file is actually a really good example of a sort of national data asset, which was sold off under the previous government and could be a really useful resource for business. I think that the answer to your sort of comment there, Ed, and I think someone in the Q&A as well was asking about the sort of where the devolved administrations will fit into the National Data Library. I think it remains to be seen, is still the answer there. I mean, I can imagine a world where, the postcode address file might be quite a useful sort of anchoring point for a new national data library, but I think it remains to be seen exactly what form that takes. Some of the registers work which the Government Digital Service undertook sort of 2015, 2016 to try and come up with those sort of underpinning infrastructure data sets, a list of officially recognized countries and so on and so forth. That's potentially one version of something that it does, but there are lots of other different things that could come out of that. So I think we're all waiting to see exactly what that looks like at the moment. The devolved question is a really important one, and again, I don't know what the answer to that will be yet. So we shall see.
I think we also talked about you talked about comparative advantage for the UK. The first wave of Gen AI products that we've seen have been massively impactful in coding, massively expansive capabilities, basically, for ordinary people working in, and we're going into that sector, but also general capability of firms are in that. That's a comparative advantage of Silicon Valley. It's no surprise that it came out of Silicon Valley, and that's the primary objective of it. The UK's one of the things that we've started to see now is Gen AI systems in financial analysis and ML in financial analysis, and that's much more the UK's focus, but also life sciences, one of the areas in the industrial strategy, but generally the UK is pretty good at life sciences, and obviously DeepMind have led a lot of the way in terms of around AlphaFold. But we've also got, the UK has natural assets and include natural data assets around the UK Biobank and more generally, just by sheer scale of the NHS's provision, data that can be used by firms. So there is some degree to which actually the next wave could be something that is the UK is able to take advantage of in quite a large way. So just to go back to that, Jason talks about the first mover advantage, and does this advance the UK soft power in influencing AI policy across the world? I think so. We talked about first mover advantage around smart data schemes, slightly different from AI policy, but obviously if there's any form, actually the UK does set, well, semi by force of fact, norms in insurance, in legal system, in contract law, and in banking. A lot just by virtue of the fact a lot of the contracts are written on it, and therefore liabilities are written on it. So there is to some degree to which the UK, by virtue of its complementary service economy with the trading with maritime trading nations and by service and also by virtue of speaking English with English-speaking countries, as well as by geographic proximity to Europe, sets some standards and some norms. It doesn't necessarily on goods, but that's not necessarily a problem. So the product and metrology bill, product safety metrology bill, which is going to look around product safety around goods, maybe there are some elements to which you might want to have that at like consolidated at an EU level, mirroring EU, but not necessarily with services. So, but that's a political question. Stuart Coleman asks, Keir Starmer at the Investment Summit brandished a need to upgrade the regulatory ecosystem. Upgrades are not free. Data informed, data monitored based digital markets regulation is surely an opportunity, as to Gavin's point. The need to have participation and engagement for civil society in the reforms and upgraded process. The CMA's ability to designate big firms as having strategic market status. Surely the UK's emerging capability of innovative data-informed regulation with our established and globally recognized legal system in our previous form of regulation can be opportune. Life Sciences and MHRA already trying to reinvent themselves in that regard. Gavin, what do you think of that?
There's a lot in there which I'm not sure I can do justice to in the remaining minutes. But I mean, just to underline something that Stuart said, actually, again, and we've been talking quite a lot about that sort of growth and delivery focus of the new government. I think there are concerns that might involve too sweeping changes to regulation. I can see there's also a question about the importance of data rights, and that slashing red tape is something that Ben Hawes has mentioned as well. So I think watch this space is the sort of cop-out answer on that. There is an awful lot happening, as you can see from the range of the questions, as well as the things that we put on the slides. We haven't even got into health data, which is something that the government is also looking at. I think my sort of concluding thought on all of that would be it's rights and regulation that can actually underpin trust in the system and allow them to operate more effectively. And I think we need to be very careful about a false opposition between innovation and regulation. The one enables the other. And it just makes it even more important that as wide a range of voices as possible are contributing to those conversations, not just for building trust, but also for making sure that ultimately the things that the government wants to see do deliver for the public.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much, Kevin, and thank you for all of your questions today. I just want to do a quick plug. Yesterday, the research team at the Open Data Institute published their taxonomy and data and AI, part of the data-centric AI program project. They also have a series of ongoing projects where they're also looking around data transparency and systems. There's a bunch of tools that were released yesterday as well. So please do check out the research section of the ODI website. Also, if you have any questions around policy, politics, issues around data or AI, please do message either myself or Gavin or any of the policy team. The contact details are on this chat on this slide here. Thank you so much, everybody. I hope you have a lovely rest of your day. Thank you from the Open Data Institute.